Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, the Missoula Hazmat team of Ziegler and Fiddler finally discovered the location of the spill and were surprised to find that MRL was already on site. Meanwhile, the gas drifted east, forcing more evacuations. We now continue with Part 1, Chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9, Entry. Epigraph. The gas completely took Alberton out. Tom Ziegler. Investigation. Sometime before Ziegler's planned entry with MRL, he took another quick look from across the river at mile marker 73. Ziegler videotaped a scene much different from a couple hours earlier. A wind had picked up, bows swinging, and the rising vapor around the wreck had dispersed. Surprisingly, MRL was already on site. 3 men walked along Reardon Lane and a rail link truck rolled by. Most remarkable was that the men weren't using respirators. They're not in the proper clothing and we don't know who they are, Ziegler recalled. They're not in contact with us. Ziegler and Jess Mickelson both said the footage was shot before Ziegler went in with MRL. Mickelson, boy, within that first 4 or 5 hours, they were really doing their own thing. And almost unreachable. Didn't want to play or interact with the rest of us. And that was a pretty scary thing. You got people in there that, for us, turned into a potential rescue. Ziegler later heard that MRL was anxious to salvage something. Come to find out they were aluminum bars, he said. Pure aluminum, which is at a very big demand at this time. They were worth $3 million, and someone was coming to get them. I looked at them and said, "You actually think someone's going to come in and pick those bars up? They're heavy, so heavy." They were afraid somebody was going to steal it, Ziegler said. As the hazmat safety officer, Ziegler told MRL prior to the joint recon, "No one's getting in there to do anything because we don't know what we have as far as other chemicals potentially spilled." But apparently, MRL workers had already gone back in. Now, Missoula Hazmat and MRL would enter together in full protection. They would need it. Before 10 a.m., Ziegler returned to the Natural Pier Bridge for the entry with his driver. Fiddler stayed at the bridge as backup. A 2-person MRL team would go separately. Everyone wore Level A personal protection equipment, or PPE. Level A included a full body suit and a self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA. Level B had SCBA, but a suit with less skin protection. Level C had a similar suit, but with only a full-face air-purifying respirator. Level D had no special suit and no respiratory protection. Ziegler had observed MRL on site earlier in Level D. Working in Level A or B was slow and exhausting, with 70 pounds or more of gear, including oxygen and respirator, bodysuit of stiff plastic, gloves, and cumbersome extra-large boots. Oxygen tanks limited working time to about 30 minutes. One trip was usually enough to tire a worker. Ziegler's team left Plateau Road to enter Reardon Lane, a dirt road that led to the railroad crossing. Ziegler monitored for chlorine and did not videotape. As Ziegler approached the tracks, to his right, east, the first 3 cars left behind by the engines remained upright. Reardon Crossing was conveniently clear in a large gap. Just west of the crossing, the next several cars were tipped over toward the north, revealing mangled undercarriages. While further west, a jumble of tankers and cars was visible, the Gordian knot. Immediately obvious from the south side was that the hopper of sodium chlorate had spilled a small pyramid of white grains on the track bed. Seemingly sprouting from the edge of this pile was a long bent rail arced high to the north, a symbolic gateway to the toxic tanks beyond. MRL's dirt access roads on either side of the tracks were largely blocked by debris from the derailment, so Ziegler's team crossed and followed Reardon Lane west between the river and the rail. On the north side lay 2 more small piles of sodium chlorate. Just to the west, the spillage from 2 lumber cars suggested a frame structure had been demolished. Next came a jackpot, the tipped contents of 2 open cars of aluminum bars. Further west, a few other cars lay off track. The main knot was 10 or 11 cars mostly perpendicular across the track or laying in the south ditch, all jammed into a rail length normally accommodating 3 cars. This, we were told, was a slow-speed derailment, Ziegler recalled, because they were having problems with the track, so they were not going at a real fast rate. Observing now, Ziegler thought, well, I'd like to see a fast one. Wow. In fact, the train had been running at normal speed, about 40 miles per hour. There was no slow order by MRL, as Ziegler recalled being told. The battered and dented tanks looked all the more impressive for their size, over 40 feet long and 10 feet in diameter. A few butt ends facing Ziegler had plowed deep into the dirt, half obscured, amid a landscape of noxious chemicals and burned vegetation. He took some photos, trying to note the tank and placard numbers. Power would need to be cut. Ziegler saw no broken wires, but lines were down and under tension across some cars, where he saw burn marks. Thank God, it seemed no flammable gases had leaked. For now, no vapor was visible, and Ziegler's chlorine monitor said all was safe. Ziegler and his driver removed their hoods, respirators at the ready. They drove back through the crossing and east down the south access road until blocked by wreckage, and observed the tanks from that angle. Ziegler spotted a possible hole in a chlorine car. Right next to it was a black tank that actually was still leaking, he said. You could see a little bit leaking out. He now had its placard number, but didn't know what it was. MRL had mentioned a solvent car was leaking, the potassium cresslate. If the chlorine tank had a hole, this was beyond the expertise of Missoula Hazmat. The site began to stir. While we were there, it started off-gassing, he said, perhaps from the warming day. And I knew it's time to go. The rising gas looked like steam, basically. It was coming off the tank, and it was coming off the ground, he said. Ziegler was standing by his truck, preparing to leave, when a helicopter dropped in over the site. He was shocked. This guy was flying less than 100 feet above our heads when he came in. Ziegler barely had time to puzzle this when the chopper whipped up a whirlwind of dust and vapor. The downwash hit and was stirring everything up, he said, and our monitors were going off. Alarms and toxic fury. The hazmat log succinctly noted at 10:04 a.m., recon team exiting with bells going off. MRL people. It all happened so fast, Ziegler didn't know which alarms triggered. They just went off and we took off, he said. He thought his alarm was set to tone at 10 parts per million, the IDLH. Once activated, an alarm could not be cleared without recalibrating the sensors. The men scrambled because no one was fully suited up. They'd been caught at the ready. As Ziegler's team sped off, he spotted the MRL crew running in their cumbersome suits to their vehicle. The incident was never publicized, but the hazmat log referred to the aircraft as a news helicopter. Sergeant Ball recalled it was a TV station using a contractor. Mickelson noted an ugly helicopter incident. The Missoula Rural Fire Department later noted no extremely high figures except 7 parts per million at the site when a helicopter flew over this morning. Other sources noted 14 to 17 parts per million near the scene on this day. Such levels were unsafe without SCBA, and any reading was just a moment in time and place. Ziegler recalled the chlorine killed the sensors on his monitor. At 10:10 a.m., the entry teams reported clear of the area, retreating to the Natural Pier Bridge to map the site. The updated Missoula Hazmat dispatch noting a, quote, light blue cloud drifting north across I-90. The, quote, grayish-blue cloud was 200 to 300 feet in elevation about a quarter-mile west of Alberton. This cloud appeared to match the description of the gray-blue cloud spotted just northwest of Alberton around 7:30 a.m., indicating it hadn't changed much in 3 hours, perhaps fed by more gas. Fiddler recalled this main cloud floating around, a shade of gray. Missoula Hazmat also noted a second gas cloud at the site, likely stirred up by the helicopter and warming day. On the way back, Ziegler helped clear Alberton. He said, when we went into Alberton checking houses, we came across doorknobs that were green, corroded, oxidized. The gas completely took Alberton out, Ziegler marveled. Missoula Hazmat reported that of 4 chlorine tanks, 1 ruptured, all contents went into atmosphere and is empty, or nearly so. Hazmat believed an entire load of chlorine had vented, but the tank had not been checked for content. Hazmat added that other chlorine cars were possibly punctured as well. While the big cloud near Alberton lingered, more evacuations were possible if it began to move. Winds were expected to increase to 20 miles per hour tonight, possibly pushing any gas east. As a result of this entry, Missoula Hazmat understood that the site was a major technical job. Hazmat also reported on, quote, industrial cleaner, spent NaOH car with rupture that Ziegler saw leaking. Sodium hydroxide was but one ingredient of the potassium cresslate, which Missoula Hazmat had not fully identified. MRL, of course, had the material safety data sheets on it all along. Even at low concentrations, sodium hydroxide alone was a potent caustic chemical, either as a liquid or an entrained aerosol mist. At noon, Mickelson updated IC Waldron that sodium hydroxide was not the problem, almost empty. That the tank was nearly empty was another speculation, since the car was at an angle. But Paul Lazy, Assistant Chief of Planning for Missoula Rural Fire Department, warned that sodium hydroxide could react and heat up. Someone at the update said, spills are separated and not close. No hazard current. Chlorine gas is going up. Entry teams had observed that the cresslate had spilled into the ditch to the south and the ongoing chlorine gas was rising. But the damaged ends of the known chlorine leaker and the cresslate tank were touching. No one knew how these two tanks initially released their loads and whether they had mixed. Decisions about evacuations had been made without knowledge of what else had spilled, and only chlorine had been monitored. IC Waldron now understood that about 80 dry gallons of sodium chlorate had spilled, not a threat beyond the spill site. That the tank of potassium cresslate solution had ruptured, believed to have spilled almost all of its load, 20,000 gallons, and also considered not a public threat. And that at least one tank of chlorine had ruptured, believed to have lost all 180,000 pounds. Yet the site continued to vent gas in a plume generally rising up, and there was concern of other chlorine tanks leaking. 8 hours after the spill, chlorine readings were reported high only at the site, but monitoring had been very limited. A separate gas cloud of undetermined size hung above Alberton, in an odd blue-gray color not generally descriptive of chlorine or HCl vapor. A few residents also noted a bluish color associated with that morning's gas release. Chemist Garen Smith later said, I don't know where you would get the blue from. A light blue plume typically meant very fine particles from combustion. Site photos from around 8 a.m. April 11 later emerged, including video frame grabs taken from KPAC's TV footage, revealing an interesting scene. A massive plume of white gas rose in indeterminate height from the tanks, billowing to the south and east. Ground zero appeared to be the ditch directly in front of where the ruptured chlorine tank intersected the potassium cresslate tank. Smith interpreted, this suggests to me that there is not a whole lot of wind. It looks like there is a mist being produced, an aerosolized mist. The sun warmed up the hillside and started a column of air rising, and this is being drawn off to replace that uplifted air. The whitish plume suggested an ongoing chemical reaction, perhaps as ice liquid chlorine thawed and resumed boiling. A bright yellow substance pooled between the chlorine and cresslate tank, as in the window of the letter A. The yellow appeared to be liquid chlorine, still pooled and perhaps iced over. An orangish substance coated the end of the ruptured chlorine tank and the upper half of the cresslate tank where the tank heads met, tapering off as if splattered upon. The orange color appeared to have splattered onto the other chlorine tanks as well, and on the adjacent ground. The original cresslate was called a dark burgundy color. Two chemical-filled tubes had ruptured side by side, bursting from their cracked heads. Chapter 10. Drift. By late morning, Mineral County moved their roadblock from Fish Creek east to the Sear exit. In the aftermath of the precautionary evacuations, fire officials wanted a hard zone for evacuation and to stick with it. Biggest concern, they said, is panic. We need Huson, 9 Mile, and Petty Creek monitors because of reports of smell of gas. There was a shortage of monitors, but 3 more were being flown into Missoula. The hard zone for evacuation was delineated as the Sear exit to 9 Mile exit. Any residents evacuated beyond this zone were allowed home later that afternoon. Any monitoring levels were not logged. Missoula Hazmat Ziegler recalled, the zone was based on everything, he said, including limited monitoring, though actually, at that time, I hate to say it, if we didn't smell it, well, we're fine type of thing. We just used our nose. Late evacuees included 84-year-old Ethel Reardon, whose eponymous lane ran by the derailment a mile east of her home. Reardon had been trapped all day. As Sergeant Dave Ball put it, she cannot get out due to the derailment blocking her driveway. Hazmat noted at 1:25 p.m. wind shift moving cloud downstream toward Reardon. Rising winds made a helicopter pickup impossible, so officials finally rescued Reardon by boat across the Clark Fork River, and she was ambulanced to Missoula. Norm Brovold Jr. and family refused to evacuate, holed up a few miles up West Mountain Creek. Sheriff Mickey O'Brien didn't force the issue after determining the house was far enough away and up in elevation to be safe for now. Nearly 10 hours after the derailment, visible gas was still reported near Alberton. Another site entry was planned for mid-afternoon, the second for Missoula Hazmat and at least the third for MRL, whose crew would now include a team from Georgia Pacific, manufacturers of the chlorine, that arrived from Washington State that afternoon. In advance of the entry, Missoula Hazmat first observed from the I-90 vantage point. At 2:55 p.m., Missoula Rural Fire Department noted tersely, "There is a fire at the site." At 3:10 p.m., Hazmat reported a recon team was going into the area without suits on to monitor. Mickelson said the industry chlorine experts felt it was safe with respirators, despite an apparent fire. The MRL team was already on site, and Missoula Hazmat still gearing up when its recon team was abruptly reassigned to evacuate more residents up Petty Creek. Evacuation, West Fork of Petty Creek. Complaints of odors and symptoms have been reported in the West Fork of Petty Creek since early morning. At 4:01 p.m., Missoula Hazmat now advised that an evacuation is mandatory for the West Fork, 12 hours after the derailment. Vic and Susan Stampley lived 1.5 miles up the West Fork. A 43-year-old psychotherapist on his day off, Stampley recalled, "I was woken at about 11 in the morning by the fire department knocking on the door. They said something about the spill. I was groggy. I think they said they were not evacuating, but they may. And I noticed I was already feeling kind of nauseous, actually, and it smelled like a heavily chlorinated indoor swimming pool. It had already seeped into the house." Stampley wasn't concerned at first, but then I got to thinking, he said, to be so heavy that it seeps into my house. As the day wore on, he felt increasingly nauseous and somewhat addled. My whole perception of the day was like this sort of semi-nauseous haze, he said. In hindsight, Stampley felt he should have been evacuated earlier. That's a lot of hours of respiratory exposure, he said. Stampley wasn't surprised that the gas arrived at the West Fork. "I hadn't been worried until I saw the videotape of the spill on TV news. It's a real energetic plume, and it's going right up the hillside towards the saddle that separates the West Fork." Though current monitoring found nothing, residents' day-long complaints finally initiated a belated evacuation. Stampley eventually went to the ER because of respiratory irritation. In every area evacuated from the Alberton spill, the gas had already arrived. As Missoula Hazmat evacuated the West Fork, the MRL Georgia Pacific team continued their recon. At 4:10 p.m., MRL briefed Missoula Hazmat. "Small fire at site," they noted. "Assessment is being made right now." Over an hour had passed since the initial fire report. Then, with no further explanation, at 4:35 p.m., Missoula Rural Fire Department noted, "There is no fire. Not sure if there ever was." Mickelson said the update on the fire was reported solely by MRL. At 3:40 p.m., Missoula Hazmat reported light blue haze, no cloud. A large bluish-gray cloud or haze had lingered near Alberton for most of the day. The latest reading logged somewhere in Alberton was 0.4 parts per million. Officials believed weather conditions had kept the gas from migrating far, but the gas had spread west to Fish Creek and east at least to Huson, and up side drainages and perhaps over mountain saddles to the north and south. Even now, the site produced a fresh plume of gas. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. In the aftermath of the toxic crisis of April 11, responders take a breath to assess the day, and we take pause to evaluate the response. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, The True Story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.